So think about this for a second. Like, how much does your intent behind an action actually matter to you?
Oh, that is a massive question right out of the gate.
Right. Because if you do something on a technicality, if you navigate the exact letter of the law to get a very specific outcome, does that change the underlying moral weight of the act itself?
Well, are you asking if you're just a brilliant strategist or if you've actually violated the spirit of the whole system you're operating in?
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah, I mean, it is basically the ultimate question of jurisprudence. We tend to think of the law as this physical boundary, you know. You're either inside the fence or you've climbed over it.
Yeah, a binary, legal or illegal.
Right. But when you examine certain ancient legal frameworks, the fence isn't just physical, it's temporal, it's psychological. The law actually cares deeply about what is in your head at the exact millisecond your hand moves.
Which is wild to think about. And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a classical Arabic text on Islamic jurisprudence, which is known as fiqh.
And I just have to say, the scope of the source material we have in front of us today is it's staggering in its diversity.
It really is. We're going to be exploring two areas of the law that, to a modern listener, are going to seem entirely divorced from one another, like completely unrelated.
Oh, absolutely. On one side, we've got these highly technical real estate loopholes, like intricate neighborhood property disputes.
Right, zoning stuff, essentially.
Yeah. And then on the exact opposite side, we have these incredibly granular, almost microscopic laws governing the hunting, slaughtering, and eating of animals.
Which, in a modern context, you would never find zoning laws and agricultural food safety regulations bound in the exact same philosophical volume.
No, never. They're handled by completely different bureaucracies today, entirely different governing principles.
But in the classical fiqh tradition, these are not separate disciplines at all. They are branches of the exact same tree.
They are, because the overarching theme binding these sources together is the profound legal and spiritual weight of, well, categorization, timing, and human intention.
So we are going to explore how these ancient scholars built this cohesive worldview around what is pure, what is foul, and how human action fundamentally transforms the natural world around you.
It's a fascinating journey.
So let's look at the real estate debate first, because
Yeah.
the mechanics of it are, they're deeply relevant to how we think about contracts today. The text introduces a concept called shufa,
Shufa, yeah.
which translates broadly to preemption rights.
Right, so Shufa is this mechanism designed to protect the social fabric of a community. It essentially dictates that if you own a property with a partner, or, if you simply have a direct next-door neighbor, they possess the right of first refusal before you can sell your property to a stranger.
Okay, let's unpack this. So if I own a house and I decide to sell it, I can't just quietly execute a contract with some outside developer and hand them the keys.
Nope. You are legally obligated to offer it to your neighbor at the agreed-upon market price first.
Wow. Okay, so the jurisprudence here is explicitly concerned with preventing harm to the neighborhood.
Exactly. The introduction of a stranger into a shared living space or like a shared agricultural space, it carries the potential for disruption.
Yeah, you don't know who is moving in.
Right. So Shufa keeps existing communities intact by giving those who are already invested in the space the power to maintain its continuity.
But of course, the text immediately moves from the ideal application of the law to the messy reality of human behavior. Because people are people.
Oh, always.
It introduces this concept of a hela, which is a legal trick or a loophole. So the fundamental question these jurists are debating is whether a buyer and seller can use a legal maneuver to intentionally drop or bypass this neighborly right of preemption.
And the answer they arrive at relies entirely on a really strict timeline.
The timeline is everything here.
It really is. They divide the scenario into two distinct phases. Actions taken after the neighbor's right has become obligatory, and actions taken before.
So let's look at that first phase. Suppose the initial agreement to sell to a stranger has already been formed, right?
Okay.
The legal mechanism of the sale has been triggered, which means the neighbor's right of shufa has officially locked into place as a tangible existing obligation.
Right, it's real now.
Yeah. So if the buyer and seller subsequently attempt a trick to force the neighbor out, like, I don't know, maybe they artificially inflate the documented price to some absurd number just to make the neighbor refuse it.
Or they attempt to nullify the sale purely to restructure it, yeah.
Exactly. The text is unequivocal here. This is unanimously deemed makruh, which basically translates to disliked or morally compromised.
Because at that point on the timeline, The right exists in reality. To execute a loophole after the obligation has materialized is to actively void an established right.
It's recognizable harm. You are destroying something that the law has already handed to your neighbor.
Precisely. The consensus holds that you cannot use the mechanics of the law to dismantle a right that the law has already fully recognized. But the real friction, the big debate, occurs when we rewind that timeline.
Right. What happens if you use a legal trick before the neighbor's right ever actually forms?
Yes.
So instead of a standard sale, what if I legally declare that I am gifting my house to this stranger?
The gifting trick.
Yeah. And by pure coincidence, wink wink, this stranger decides to gift me a large sum of money shortly after. In the strictest reading of the text, a gift does not trigger the neighbor's right of preemption, only a formalized sale does.
Right.
I have used a recognized legal avenue to transfer the property, but I specifically chose the avenue that bypasses the neighbor entirely.
And this specific scenario causes a massive fracture between two of the foundational giants of this legal tradition, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad.
And they were both prominent students of the really influential jurist Abu Hanifa.
Right. They were. Yet they look at this exact preemptive trick and formulate entirely opposing rulings.
Okay, so Abu Yusuf argues that this preemptive maneuver is perfectly fine. It's permissible.
Yeah, he takes a very structuralist view of the law. His argument is that you are simply preventing a right from occurring in the first place.
You can't destroy something that hasn't been built yet.
Exactly. Abu Yusuf is defending the bounds of individual agency. The legal system provides multiple valid mechanisms for transferring property, right? Sales, gifts, charitable endowments.
Sure.
If a property owner surveys those options and deliberately selects the one that does not trigger a secondary obligation, they are merely navigating the law. Abu Yusuf argues this is fundamentally no different than an owner simply choosing never to sell the house at all.
So in his framework, preventing the occurrence of a right by initiating the legal cause of its prevention is just good strategy. It's not a transgression.
Exactly. It's strategy.
It's like, okay, it's the ancient equivalent of aggressive tax structuring.
Well, that's a great analogy.
Yeah. Like, if you completely restructure your assets, move funds around into different categories, and alter your corporate status weeks before the end of the fiscal year, you're doing that entirely to prevent a massive tax liability from forming on December 31st.
Right. You haven't evaded a tax you already owed. You legally positioned yourself so that the tax would never be owed in the first place.
Yeah. And Abu Yusuf is arguing for the validity of that strategic positioning.
That captures his structuralist logic perfectly. But then we have to look at the opposing view of Muhammad, because he completely rejects this.
He is not having it.
Not at all. He argues that this preemptive trick is still morally compromised and disliked, regardless of whether it's executed before the obligation formally materializes.
But why? I mean, if we accept the premise that the right doesn't exist yet, who exactly is the victim here?
Well, Muhammad is looking past the immediate mechanics of the single transaction. He's evaluating the teleological purpose of the law itself, like the ultimate goal the law is trying to achieve.
The spirit of the law, essentially.
Exactly. His argument operates on a macro-societal level. He posits that if this preemptive gifting trick is normalized, if the legal culture just accepts that anyone can easily bypass their neighbors through a simple paperwork maneuver, then the entire institution of Shufa collapses.
You effectively render a protective community-building law entirely obsolete.
Yes. He is arguing that the spirit of the law, the societal intent behind it, has to supersede the strict literalist manipulation of its categories. If the law exists to protect neighbors, you can't use the law to invent a reality where neighbors have no protection.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does. Muhammad is wary of a legal system that allows its own internal logic to defeat its primary purpose.
So how does the text resolve this?
Well, when synthesizing these positions, the text navigates a very careful middle ground. It acknowledges the structural reality of Abu Yusuf's position, that legally, preventing a right from forming is not the same as destroying one, so the state can't really penalize the action.
Right, you can't be arrested for it.
But it holds Muhammad's view as a vital standard of spiritual prudence. The legal framework respects the timeline of reality. The precise timing of when an action is taken dictates its validity.
And this obsession with timing, cause, and categorization, this is the underlying architecture of this entire system.
It absolutely is.
And to understand just how deeply that philosophy penetrates, we have to follow the text as it pivots entirely away from human contracts and property lines.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, it applies this exact same logic to the natural world. If intention and timing matter that much for a legal loophole, how does that framework apply when you're dealing with raw nature?
The transition in the text is jarring only if you view the law as a collection of separate subjects. But if you view it as a unified theory of categorization, the pivot makes perfect sense.
The text moves to establish the boundaries of what is considered pure to consume what is halal. And the very first boundary it draws is geographical. It separates the land from the sea.
Yes. The ocean is treated almost as an entirely separate jurisdiction, operating under rules that just do not apply to the terrestrial world.
Right, the text outlines this massive jurisprudential debate right at the shoreline regarding what marine life is permissible to eat.
We see a really sharp divergence here. The Hanafi school, which is the tradition from which this text originates, they maintain a highly restrictive view. They argue that within the marine environment, absolutely nothing is permissible to eat except fish. Every other creature is forbidden.
Wow, so if it lacks the defining morphological characteristics of a fish, it is off limits.
Completely off limits.
Frogs, crabs, lobsters, all forbidden. The text even explicitly references creatures like the sea pig and the sea dog, which, most likely describe seals, walruses, or maybe certain types of sharks, strictly prohibited.
But then you have the Shafi scholars operating from the exact same foundational religious text, and they arrive at the diametrically opposite conclusion.
They argue that everything pulled from the sea is lawful to consume.
Everything. And this divergence is rooted in linguistics and the methodology of interpreting general versus specific textual permissions.
How so?
Well, the Shafi argument is built on a direct, expansive reading of a specific Quranic verse which states, "Lawful to you is the game of the sea and its food."
Okay.
The Arabic term used there is sa'id, which translates to the catch, or that which is hunted. Shafi'i scholars take this term at its absolute broadest literal meaning. If a creature lives in the water and you can catch it, it falls under the general permission of the sea.
That seems pretty straightforward.
They also rely on a documented statement from the Prophet Muhammad, who, when asked about the ocean, replied, "Its water is purifying and its dead creatures are lawful."
Okay, so for Shafi, that statement is absolute. There is no caveat excluding a crab or a seal.
Exactly.
So how did the Hanafis defend such a strict prohibition when faced with a verse that seemingly permits all the game of the sea? I mean, it sounds like the text is pretty clear.
The Hanafis engage in a much more restrictive linguistic analysis of that term, Saeed. They argue that the concept of hunting intrinsically describes an action taken against a wild, evasive creature.
Okay.
But once that creature is dead, hauled out of the water, and prepared for consumption, it ceases to be the hunted and transitions into the category of food or meat.
Ah, I see.
Therefore, they argue the verse is legally permitting the act of fishing, meaning you aren't penalized for the action of hunting in the sea, but it is not granting a blanket dietary approval for every biological entity you manage to extract.
So they're separating the legality of the extraction from the legality of the consumption?
Exactly.
But wait, what prevents them from just eating the crab anyway? Why restrict it if the act of catching it is fine?
Because they look to other overriding general principles within the text. There are explicit prohibitions against eating carrion corpses and against eating kaba'ith, which translates to foul or impure things.
Foul things. Okay.
The Hanafis argue that creatures like frogs or crabs naturally repel what they call the sound human disposition. They categorize these animals as foul, creeping things, much like spiders or insects on land.
Oh, interesting.
So they argue that the general permission granted to the sea is restricted by the general prohibition against consuming foul things. The fish is the sole exception, because another specific textual tradition explicitly permits two types of dead creatures, fish and locusts.
So the fish is essentially removed from the category of foul things by textual decree, leaving everything else in the sea forbidden for them.
Precisely.
Which brings us to one of the most fascinating forensic debates in the entire text. Let's focus solely on the fish for a minute, since both schools agree that catching a live fish is lawful.
Right.
The text asks, what happens if you do not catch the fish yourself? Like, what if you're walking along the bank of a river and you find a dead fish floating on the surface of the water?
Yes, this is known as the debate of the Tafi, the floating fish.
And this scenario perfectly encapsulates the text's obsession with causality. The physical object is the exact same. It's a dead fish. But its legal and spiritual status is entirely dependent on the specific mechanism that caused its death.
The text demands that you investigate the timeline of its demise.
Hmm.
If the fish died what the scholars term a natural death, perhaps it succumbed to old age or an internal disease or biological failure and subsequently floated to the surface, it is haram. It is strictly forbidden to consume.
And the logic here is ontological, right?
Yes, a natural death fundamentally alters the state of the animal. It transitions it into the category of carrion. It's a corpse that simply expired and succumbed to internal decay.
So in this jurisprudential framework, a corpse is inherently impure because the life force in the blood simply stagnated and spoiled within the tissue. There was no external force that initiated a transition. The biological machine just stopped.
Exactly. But if that exact same fish died from a sudden external cause and you find it floating on the surface, it is completely halal. It is lawful to eat.
Wait, really?
Yes. The text provides highly specific environmental examples. If the ambient temperature of the water suddenly spiked and became too hot, or dropped and became too cold, and the fish died from temperature shock halal.
Oh, wow.
Or if the water became heavily saturated with mud and the fish suffocated. Or if it was attacked and partially eaten by a larger fish and the remains floated to the top. If any of those external environmental factors were the cause of death, the fish is pure.
We have to deeply examine the underlying philosophy of that distinction. Because why does a cold snap render a fish pure while a heart attack renders it impure?
Because death by an external environmental force is functionally categorized by these jurists as being hunted.
The environment itself becomes the hunter.
Precisely. The sudden influx of cold water caught the fish. The suffocating mud hunted the fish. It didn't expire from internal stagnant decay. It was subjected to an external trauma that forced the life out of it.
That is wild.
The presence of that external pause is the necessary mechanism that shifts the animal out of the category of impure carrion and into the category of lawful catch.
But the practical application of this law requires, an ancient form of forensic pathology.
It really does.
I mean, if you're a traveler standing on the banks of the Tigris River and you see a fish, how do you mathematically prove the cause of death?
No, they didn't have labs.
Exactly. So the text quotes a scholar offering a methodology based on deductive reasoning. He states that if you find the fish partially on land and partially in the water specifically, if its head is resting on the dry bank, you may consume it.
Because the deductive assumption there is that the fish physically leaped out of the water, became stranded, and died of suffocation.
Right. And suffocation is an external traumatic cause. However, if you find the fish with its head submerged in the water and its tail resting on the land, it's forbidden.
Because the assumption there is that its gills were fully submerged, meaning it had access to oxygen, and therefore it must have died of some internal natural failure while resting near the edge.
They are attempting to reconstruct the final moments of the animal's life using only physical evidence, because those final moments dictate its legal purity.
It's ancient CSI.
It really is. The text even acknowledges internal debate about the validity of temperature as a cause. Some jurists argued that heat and cold are invisible forces. They aren't tangible weapons like a spear or a net, so they shouldn't count as a valid cause.
But the dominant, established ruling asserts that extreme temperatures are indeed valid external causes of death.
The sheer amount of intellectual energy being expended here is meant to ensure that the consumption of life is never an accident. The universe is not a passive buffet.
Oh, I like that phrasing.
There must be a recognized mechanism, a verifiable cause, that transitions the animal from a living participant in the ecosystem into human sustenance. If that mechanism is absent, the human being has no right to consume it.
And that principle of restricted access only intensifies as the text moves from the alien environment of the ocean to the heavily zoned environment of the land.
Yeah, so when categorizing land animals, the text utilizes a very specific biological metric to determine purity: blood.
In this framework, blood is the ultimate dual symbol. While flowing through a living creature, it is the vehicle of life. But the moment the creature dies, blood instantly becomes the vehicle of impurity and decay.
It's fascinating. The scholars establish a baseline rule regarding creatures that lack a traditional circulatory system. Animals without any blood whatsoever, insects like spiders, scorpions, flies, wasps, and animals that possess blood, but not flowing blood reptiles and amphibians like snakes, mice, geckos, and lizards, are immediately categorized as khabith.
Foul things.
Foul things they are absolutely forbidden to consume.
And the rationale provided by the jurists is deeply tied to their understanding of human nature. The text asserts that these specific creatures are naturally rejected by what they term the sound, healthy human disposition.
They operate on the premise that there is a universal, innate psychological revulsion to consuming a spider or a snake.
Exactly. The law is essentially codifying that presumed natural revulsion into a hard legal boundary.
But, and there's always a but, there's one massive, swarming, highly visible exception to this rule of bloodless creatures: the locust.
Ah, the locust. The locust presents a fascinating jurisprudential anomaly. It is unequivocally a bloodless insect. By the text's own logical metrics regarding the sound human disposition, it belongs firmly in the category of foul things. Yet, it is unanimously permitted for consumption.
Okay, I have to push back playfully here. If the law is based on a universal human revulsion to insects, a swarming plague of locusts is hardly an appetizing exception. Why does the logic break down here?
It doesn't break down, actually. It is overridden by textual authority. The scholars permit the locust simply because the Prophet Muhammad explicitly and specifically permitted it. We return to that earlier quote. Two types of dead creatures are permitted to us: fish and locusts.
Ah.
The jurists openly admit that through pure logical deduction, the locust should be forbidden. But in this legal system, specific divine permission acts as an override code. The textual decree pulls the locust out of the logical box it belongs in.
Okay, so this tension between textual precedent and biological categorization erupts into a massive debate over a specific animal later on: the dab, or the desert lizard.
Oh, this is a great one.
This is a large, herbivorous, spiky-tailed lizard native to the Arabian Peninsula, and the schools of thought completely fracture over its status.
They do. The Shafi school argues that consuming the desert lizard is entirely lawful. Their jurisprudential evidence is based on historical documentation. They point to recorded instances where the closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad consumed the meat of this lizard while sitting directly at his table in his presence.
Right, and if the companions ate it right in front of him and he did not forbid them, that is considered tacit approval.
Yes, in Islamic law, the Prophet's silent affirmation implies that the act cannot be a sin.
That is the foundation of the Shafi argument. But the Hanafi scholars, the authors of the main text we're looking at, push back aggressively. They argue the desert lizard is strictly forbidden, and their evidence centers on a very specific, deeply personal narrative involving the Prophet's household.
The story of Aisha.
Yes. The story goes that the Prophet's wife, Aisha, received the meat of a desert lizard as a gift. She prepared it and offered it to him, and he adamantly refused to eat it.
Now, a Shafi jurist looks at that refusal and dismisses its legal weight. They argue it was merely a personal human distaste. The Prophet was a cosmopolitan city dweller from Mecca. He wasn't a Bedouin accustomed to the rugged diet of the deep desert.
Right.
In their view, a personal culinary preference does not establish a universal religious prohibition.
But the Hanafis argue that the context of the story extends beyond a simple refused meal. When the Prophet declined the meat, a beggar woman came to their door asking for food. Aisha, naturally assuming she could redirect the unwanted meal, prepared to give the lizard meat to the beggar.
But the Prophet intervened and stopped her.
He asked Aisha, "Do you feed others what you do not eat?" He explicitly forbade her from distributing the meat as an act of charity.
And that intervention is the linchpin of the Hanafi legal argument. If the lizard was simply unappetizing to his personal palate, there would be no moral issue with allowing a starving beggar to consume the calories.
Exactly.
The fact that he actively prevented the meat from being used as charity implies that his refusal was not based on taste, but on a deeper spiritual prohibition regarding the nature of the animal itself.
And the text offers a rationale for this prohibition that ventures into profound theological territory. Why was there such a deep aversion to this specific lizard?
The text speculates, drawing on other historical narrations, that the Prophet feared the lizard was a remnant of a transformed nation.
We are touching upon the concept of the musuk here.
Yes, This is an incredibly dense theological concept within the classical tradition.
The Musuk refers to ancient groups of human beings who committed such grievous transgressions that they were cursed by the divine and physically transformed into animals as a permanent punishment.
It's a terrifying concept, honestly.
It is, and the text lists several animals, bears, apes, elephants, as potential physical descendants of these cursed human nations. And the narration suggests that when the prophet saw the desert lizard being cooked by his companions during a military expedition, he experienced a moment of profound dread.
He allegedly stated, "A nation was transformed in the earth, and I fear this is from them," and he ordered the cooking pots to be overturned.
Wow.
But the jurisprudential weight of that statement lies in its uncertainty. The prophet did not issue a dogmatic, absolute declaration that the lizard was definitively a cursed human being. He used the phrase, "I fear."
Right, it was an expression of deep spiritual hesitation,
Yeah.
an abundance of caution in the face of the unknown.
And the Hanafi scholars operate heavily on the legal principle that acting upon a hesitation regarding a prohibition is better. When faced with the terrifying possibility that you might be consuming the physical manifestation of divine wrath, the only safe legal course is total abstinence.
It fundamentally alters how a human being interacts with the natural world. You are looking at a reptile in the desert and wondering, is this simply a biological organism, or is this the ongoing breathing consequence of a historical moral failure?
The physical world is not just matter, it is porous to the spiritual world. The landscape is laden with historical and moral weight.
That concept of animals possessing a deeper ontological status, a designated purpose beyond mere existence, it becomes even more pronounced as the text moves from the wild desert into the domestic sphere of the barnyard.
The text begins to categorize the beasts of burden, the animals that actively participate in human labor.
So the text establishes the uncontroversial baseline first. Domestic cattle, sheep, and camels are halal. They're categorized as the standard grazing livestock, explicitly designed and permitted for human consumption.
Right.
But then the text turns its attention to the animals that perform the heavy lifting of civilization, donkeys and mules. And the ruling is absolute. The consumption of domestic donkeys and mules is strictly forbidden.
What is vital to understand here is that this was not always the case. The text documents a specific historical moment when the legal status of the donkey permanently shifted. The prohibition was solidified during the Battle of Khaybar.
The narrative surrounding this is really striking. Before this specific military campaign, the early Muslim community did consume domestic donkeys.
They did.
But during the siege of Khaybar, the army was suffering from severe starvation. In desperation, the soldiers captured several domestic donkeys, slaughtered them, and had the meat actively boiling in their cooking pots.
And it was at that exact moment of desperation that the prophet ordered a town crier to move through the camp and announce that God and his messenger officially forbid the meat of domestic donkeys, categorizing it as rees, an abomination or inherent filth.
He commanded the starving army to dump the boiling pots out onto the ground.
Which is an incredible command during a famine. The jurists heavily analyzed the timing and context of this ban. Why command a starving army to destroy viable protein?
The text explores and ultimately rejects several logistical theories. Was the meat forbidden because the donkeys were captured war booty that had not yet been legally distributed among the soldiers? No.
Was it because the army was in desperate need of transport and eating your own supply chain during a siege is a catastrophic tactical error?
No. Was it because the donkeys had been wandering the village and eating garbage, making them temporarily impure?
No. The scholars systematically eliminate all those temporary educational explanations. They conclude that the declaration of the meat, as rees, indicates a permanent intrinsic change in the biological and spiritual status of the animal.
The domestic donkey was permanently recategorized from potential food to abomination.
And the mule legally follows suit, as the foundational rule of this jurisprudence dictates that offspring inherit the legal prohibition of the mother, and a mule is born from a horse and a donkey.
This permanent recategorization sets the stage for what I consider the most poetic and philosophically intense debate in the entire text, the legal status of the horse.
Yes. Can a human being consume the meat of a horse?
This is where Abu Hanifa's specific brand of teleological jurisprudence, focusing on the ultimate purpose of a thing, truly shines.
Absolutely. Abu Hanifa rules that the consumption of horse meat is makruh, disliked to such a severe degree that it borders on strict prohibition.
However, his two most prominent students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, the same ones from the real estate debate earlier, they respectfully break from their teacher here.
They argue that horse meat is completely halal, and they base their ruling on documented historical precedent. They point out that the companions of the prophet were known to have consumed horse meat during military campaigns without facing any divine or prophetic reprimand.
The students are employing a highly pragmatic, evidence-based legal methodology. Their argument is straightforward. The earliest, most pious generation engaged in the act. They were not stopped, therefore the act is legally sound.
But Abu Hanifa's rationale for forbidding it transcends historical anecdote. He grounds his argument in a profound reading of a specific Quranic verse. He cites the verse, "And he created the horses, mules, and donkeys for you to ride, and as an adornment."
Okay, so he's looking at the stated purpose.
Exactly. Abu Hanifa draws attention to the fact that the divine explicitly listed the intended purposes for these specific animals: riding and beauty. They are vehicles of transport and symbols of prestige.
And he notes that in entirely separate verses regarding cattle, sheep, and camels, the text explicitly adds the phrase, "and from them you eat."
Yes, that phrase is noticeably absent regarding the horse. Abu Hanifa is constructing a legal argument based on a hierarchy of purpose. He is asserting that the divine architect designed the horse for a noble, elevated function within the context of human civilization.
The horse is the engine of exploration, the vanguard of warfare, and a majestic aesthetic presence. To take an animal designed for such a high, complex utility and reduce it to mere butchery for a quick meal is to fundamentally disrespect its divine design. If I can propose a modern equivalent, it's akin to owning a highly specialized piece of machinery, like a multi-million-dollar Formula One car or a complex agricultural combine harvester.
Oh, I like this.
If you suddenly feel hungry, you could theoretically take a sledgehammer, smash the machine to pieces, melt down the scrap metal, sell it, and buy a sandwich. Physically, you have the power to do it. You own the object,
Right.
but you are destroying something intricately designed for a much higher specific utility simply to satisfy a base temporary urge.
That captures the essence of his argument perfectly. Abu Hanifa goes further, suggesting that the sound human disposition actually recoils from the idea of eating a horse. But it's not a revulsion based on the meat being physically toxic like a spider. It's a psychological and moral revulsion.
You do not butcher your comrade in arms.
Exactly. You do not consume the creature that carried you into battle and facilitated your survival.
But his students counter this by maintaining that in the brutal reality of a prolonged siege, a horse represents vital calories, and the law must possess the flexibility to allow for human survival.
And the text reconciles this tension beautifully. It acknowledges that the companions only consumed horses during moments of extreme existential military necessity. That emergency context does not invalidate Abu Hanifa's general baseline rule. Under normal, stable circumstances, you do not eat your most noble vehicle.
It reveals a societal framework that refuses to view animals merely as walking protein repositories. They are active participants in human civilization, endowed with specific God-given roles that demand respect.
So far, we've examined the innate categories of animals, what they inherently are. But the text now shifts to examine what the animal does and how an animal's actions can temporarily alter its legal status.
We are entering the realm of the Jalala.
Yes, the Jalala refers to the filth-eating animal. This section of the text is a masterclass in ancient empiricism and observable reality.
Okay, imagine you own a perfectly pure halal animal, a domestic camel, a cow, or a chicken. But this animal escapes its enclosure and begins scavenging. It consumes human waste, rotting garbage, and impurities. The question that jurists most answer is, at what point does the consumption of impurity corrupt the legal purity of the animal itself?
The brilliance of the text is that it does not rely on the mere concept or knowledge of the animal eating garbage. The standard is entirely empirical. The impurity must physically manifest in the flesh of the animal.
So if the animal consumes such a vast quantity of filth that its meat or the milk it produces begins to physically emit a foul, noticeable stench, it officially crosses the threshold and is categorized as jalala.
And the moment that stench is detectable, a cascade of prohibitions falls into place. It becomes strictly forbidden to consume its meat. It is forbidden to drink its milk. The text even explicitly states that it becomes forbidden to ride the animal.
The prohibition against riding it is such a fascinating detail to me. Why restrict the utility of the animal if you aren't consuming it?
Well, the text explains that if you were to ride the animal into a public space, the physical exertion would cause the animal to sweat, and the resulting stench of the impurity sweating out of its pores would be an active nuisance to the people around you in the marketplace.
It's an ancient public disturbance law based purely on olfactory offense.
Exactly. But the critical jurisprudential mechanism here is that the animal has not permanently mutated into a different species. It is suffering from a temporary acquired condition. Because the condition is acquired through diet, it can be reversed through diet.
So the text prescribes a mandatory detox period, a quarantine. To restore the animal to a halal state, you are required to confine it, restrict its movement, and strictly force-feed it clean, pure fodder.
And you must maintain this quarantine until the physical stench completely dissipates from its body. The scholars debate the exact duration of this detox.
Right. Abu Hanifa, prioritizing observable reality over arbitrary numbers, refuses to set a strict timeline. He simply mandates that it must be confined until the smell is entirely gone.
But his student, Abu Yusuf, recognizing the need for practical, standardized metrics for the common person, issues specific rulings, like a mandatory 3-day quarantine for a chicken.
It serves as a remarkable example of early, systematic food safety protocols. But philosophically, it highlights the law's deep pragmatism regarding environmental realities.
This pragmatism is especially evident when the text addresses the reality of free-range livestock.
Yeah, if you allow your chickens to roam freely around a rural village, it is an unavoidable biological fact that they will peck at the dirt, consume insects, and occasionally ingest waste. Does the mere presence of that waste render every village chicken forbidden?
The text rules that free-range chickens are perfectly halal. The reasoning is based on dilution. A free-range chicken consumes a highly mixed diet. It may ingest trace amounts of waste, but it primarily consumes grain, seeds, and grass.
The trace impurity never reaches the critical mass necessary to overtake the animal's biological system and produce that defining stench.
The law intentionally ignores microscopic conceptual impurities. It only enforces prohibitions when the impurity crosses the threshold of human sensory perception.
And this reliance on observable physical reality over conceptual fear leads to the most provocative hypothetical scenario in this entire section.
Oh, the goat.
Yes, the goat. The jurists pose a question. What happens if a baby goat, which is an inherently pure halal animal, nurses exclusively from a female pig, which is the absolute pinnacle of inherent impurity, until the goat reaches physical maturity?
It is the ultimate stress test for the legal principles governing the Jalala.
Right. When you first hear that scenario, the instinct is to assume the goat is permanently corrupted. I mean, it has literally built its entire physical form out of the milk of a forbidden creature. But the ruling of the scholars completely defies that instinct.
They rule that if you slaughter that goat, and the resulting meat does not physically emit a foul stench or display visible corruption, the goat is completely halal to consume.
It is a stunningly empirical approach.
It's entirely consistent with their framework. The law actively rejects magical thinking. The conceptual pigness of the milk does not magically transfer to the goat like some indestructible spiritual virus.
The goat's internal digestive system processed the milk, broke down the proteins, and utilized the nutrients to grow goat muscle.
The law asserts that biology transforms the substance. Unless the physical flesh of the goat is demonstrably tainted by a foul stench, which would be the only acceptable proof that the impurity somehow survived the biological process, the meat retains the pure status of a goat.
The law cares exclusively about the physical reality sitting in front of you. And this strict focus on physical mechanics brings us to the surgical reality of how an animal is actually dispatched. We have to transition from the physical state of the animal to the physical act of the human being holding the blade.
We are entering the jurisprudence of Dab, the specific ritual slaughter for sheep and cows, and Nar, the spearing at the base of the neck utilized for camels.
This process is not merely about ending the biological function of the animal. It is a highly regulated, mandatory system of bloodletting. The text identifies 4 specific critical veins in the throat of the animal: the trachea, or windpipe, the esophagus, or food pipe, and the 2 major jugular veins situated on either side that carry the heavy flow of blood.
The overarching non-negotiable goal of this act, as explicitly stated by the jurists, is the rapid and total expulsion of the forbidden flowing blood.
Right.
As we discussed earlier, once the animal is dead, blood transitions from a vital life force into the primary vehicle of decay. It must be evacuated from the tissue.
To achieve this purification, the throat must be cut. But the scholars debate the precise anatomical requirements of that cut. Abu Hanifa rules that the butcher must successfully sever at least 3 of those 4 specific veins.
If the blade cuts the windpipe, the food pipe, and at least one of the jugular veins, the required threshold for draining the blood has been met, and the meat is halal.
However, Shafi takes a significantly more lenient anatomical stance. He rules that if the butcher simply severs the windpipe and the food pipe, the slaughter is valid and the meat is lawful.
The logic driving their disagreement reveals two fundamentally different understandings of what the act of slaughter is actually meant to achieve. Shafi argues from a perspective of mortality.
Okay.
He posits that the primary purpose of the ritual cut is to ensure the life of the animal ends quickly and definitively. If you sever the windpipe and the food pipe, biological life cannot be sustained. You have successfully killed the animal through a recognized method.
But Abu Hanifa counters that simply ending the life is not the legal objective. A massive blow to the head with a rock will kill the animal just as definitively, yet that meat is strictly haram.
Exactly. The legal objective is the purification of the flesh via the draining of the blood. And from an anatomical standpoint, you cannot efficiently evacuate the blood from the body without severing at least one of the major jugular veins.
Abu Hanifa is asserting that death is merely a byproduct of the required purification process. And to ensure that purification is achieved correctly, the law meticulously regulates the physical tools that can be used.
Right.
The text permits the use of a standard metal knife, but it also accounts for survival situations. If you are isolated in the wilderness, you are permitted to use a marwa, a sharply fractured stone, or a stiff, sharpened reed. Essentially, you may use any object that possesses a definitive cutting edge.
However, there is a rigid, absolute prohibition against using teeth or detached claws and nails to perform the slaughter.
So you cannot simply rip the animal's throat open using a sharp animal horn or a human tooth.
The reasoning behind this prohibition requires an understanding of physics and tissue trauma. A sharpened stone or a metal blade slices. It parts the physical tissue cleanly, opening the veins and allowing the blood to flow out without obstruction.
But a tooth or a nail, by its very biological design, is meant to crush and tear.
Right. If you attempt to open a vein with a crushing tool, you are essentially bludgeoning or strangling the tissue. The crushing action bruises the flesh and traps the flowing blood inside the traumatized muscle, directly defeating the primary goal of the slaughter.
The text becomes incredibly precise regarding this physical trauma. It poses a seemingly morbid hypothetical. What if a butcher strikes a camel's neck with a heavy sword and applies so much force that he completely decapitates the animal in a single, massive swing?
The jurists rule that the meat of the decapitated camel is legally halal because the violent swing successfully severed all 4 required veins and the blood drained. However, they rule that the butcher has committed a sin, or at the very least, a deeply disliked action.
Because he introduced excessive, unnecessary violence into a regulated process.
Yes. The text cites a governing ethical principle. Do not increase the pain of the animal beyond what is necessary for the slaughter.
A clean, measured slice opens the veins and initiates the draining process with minimal trauma. Full decapitation is a failure of precision. It's excessive force that violates the dignity of the act.
And this intense focus on biological precision brings us to one of the most philosophically profound debates in the entire classical tradition: the status of the unborn.
This is a complex scenario. What happens if a butcher slaughters a pregnant sheep, following all the correct protocols, but when the animal is opened, they discover a fully formed but dead fetus inside the womb? Is the meat of that fetus halal to consume?
This forces the ancient jurists to debate the very definitions of life, biological independence, and dependency, centuries before the advent of modern biology. Abu Hanifa takes the definitive stance. Absolutely not. The fetus is strictly forbidden.
His reasoning is that the fetus constitutes a separate, independent life form residing within the mother.
Exactly. When the mother's throat was cut, the mother's specific blood drained from her specific veins, but the fetus's throat was never cut. Therefore, when the mother's oxygen supply ceased, the fetus died of internal suffocation. It is a separate corpse filled with its own undrained, forbidden blood.
But Abu Hanifa's own students, alongside Shafi, strongly disagree with him here. They rule that the fetus is completely halal. They rely on a well-known legal maxim: the slaughter of the mother is the slaughter of the fetus.
They view the biology holistically. They argue that the fetus is not yet an independent life. It is biologically tethered and dependent. It functions essentially as an internal organ of the mother.
Just as the mother's heart and liver are rendered pure when her blood drains, the fetus is rendered pure by the systemic purification of the macroorganism.
But Abu Hanifa counters this holistic view with acute observation. He asks, if the fetus is merely an internal organ of the mother, How is it possible for the fetus to survive for several minutes after the mother has been definitively slaughtered?
Which was a known fact. If a pregnant animal was cut open swiftly enough after slaughter, the fetus might still be found alive and moving.
Abu Hanifa argues that this independent movement proves the fetus possesses its own distinct spark of life, separate from the mother's biological system. Because it possesses independent life, it requires its own independent ritual slaughter to drain its specific blood.
It is a breathtaking debate about where the boundary of an individual organism begins and ends. But all of this surgical precision, locating the exact veins, managing the trauma, debating the status of the womb, it all relies on one massive assumption, that the animal is docile, restrained, and compliant.
Which is rarely the case.
Right. The law must account for the chaotic reality of an animal that refuses to cooperate.
This introduces the jurisprudence of Akwar, the laws governing emergency slaughter.
There are situations where reaching the neck of the animal is physically impossible. If you are actively hunting a wild deer in the forest, or if your normally docile domestic cow suddenly becomes rabid, breaks its tether, and charges into the brush, you can't enforce the standard surgical protocols.
In these scenarios of necessity, the law fundamentally shifts its requirements. You are no longer required to sever the specific veins in the neck. You are permitted to strike or wound the animal anywhere on its body.
You may shoot an arrow into its flank, its leg, its back, and as long as that wound causes the blood to flow, the slaughter is considered legally valid.
The governing principle here is that necessity relaxes the strictures of the law. When the ideal designated location for purification, the neck, is physically inaccessible, any location on the body that successfully achieves the ultimate goal, the draining of the blood, is accepted as a valid substitute.
However, this relaxation of the rules does not mean a descent into total chaos. There are still strict parameters, particularly when utilizing proxies like hunting dogs or trained falcons.
Yes. If a hunter releases a trained hound to bring down a deer, the text is adamant. The dog must physically wound the prey with its teeth or claws, breaking the skin and drawing blood.
If the hound is large and powerful and it simply tackles the deer, pins it to the earth, and crushes its windpipe or suffocates it without ever piercing the skin, the meat is absolutely haram.
Because the logic remains incredibly consistent. If the skin is not broken, the blood has not flowed. The dog has essentially bludgeoned or strangled the animal to death.
In this context, the dog is not acting as an independent animal. It is acting as a proxy weapon for the human hunter. If the hunter's arrow must pierce the skin to validate the kill, the hunter's biological weapon, the dog, must also pierce the skin.
The dog must act as a surgical instrument. That is a profound level of responsibility placed on the mechanics of a hound.
It really is. And this idea of the environment dictating the application of the law leads to a brilliant geographical distinction. We discussed how a runaway domestic animal, like a rabid camel, is legally treated like wild game. Because a camel is massive and potentially lethal, if it bolts, you are permitted to shoot it with an arrow because you cannot physically overpower it.
But the text forces the jurist to consider the specific context of the runaway animal. It asks a highly specific question. What if the runaway animal is not a massive camel, but a simple domestic sheep?
The answer entirely depends on geography. The text states that if your sheep breaks loose and runs away while you are out in the vast open expanse of the desert, and it is impossible for you to run it down, you are permitted to shoot it with an arrow.
In the endless desert, the sheep has functionally become a wild, inaccessible animal.
However, if that exact same sheep breaks loose in the middle of a densely populated, busy city, you are strictly forbidden from pulling out a bow and shooting it in the street.
The jurisprudential logic is flawless. The ability to perform the original rule prevents moving to the substitute.
If you are in a city, the environment itself provides a solution. Eventually, that sheep is going to run down a blind alleyway and get cornered, or a group of neighbors will help you encircle it. The physical reality of the urban environment guarantees that you will, eventually, be able to restrain the animal and perform the standard, precise neck slaughter.
You cannot invoke the relaxed emergency rules when the environment you are standing in allows for the proper execution of the law.
It demonstrates that these legal frameworks are not abstract, arbitrary religious hurdles. They are deeply, inherently responsive to physical reality, geography, and physics. A human being is only permitted to abandon the standard protocol when the physical reality of the world genuinely forces their hand.
Which brings us to the final, most crucial element of this entire system. We have examined the nature of the property, the biological categorization of the animal, the physics of the tools, and the geography of the environment. But none of it matters without examining the internal state of the human being holding the knife.
Right. Who is legally permitted to take a life, and what must be in their mind when they do?
The text establishes a baseline regarding the butcher. The individual performing the slaughter must possess sanity and the capacity for intentionality. A young child who cannot comprehend the gravity of taking a life, or an individual who is severely intoxicated, cannot produce halal meat. They lack the cognitive capacity to form a valid legal intention.
The text also addresses religious identity, broadly permitting Muslims, Jews, and Christians to perform the slaughter as they belong to traditions that recognize the divine origin of the animal.
The text even includes a fascinating historical footnote where the scholars Ali and Ibn Abbas debated whether ethnically Arab Christians should be included, given their unique geopolitical status, but the consensus ultimately lands on broad inclusion.
But for the Hanafi scholars, the identity of the butcher is secondary to the ultimate non-negotiable requirement of the act, the basmala, the verbal utterance of the name of God.
This is the crescendo of the entire jurisprudential framework. The phrase Bismillah, in the name of God, must be spoken before the strike.
For the Hanafi jurists, if a butcher remembers this requirement but intentionally chooses to remain silent, the meat is instantly haram. It is categorized as dead carrion, regardless of how perfectly the veins were severed.
Because without that specific invocation of the divine, the human being is reduced to a mere predator killing for calories. The spoken utterance of the name is the mechanism that legally and spiritually sanctions the violence. It acknowledges that the life of the animal belongs to the Creator, and permission is being explicitly sought to take it.
But the law has to account for human frailty. What happens if a professional butcher, a man who slaughters hundreds of sheep a day, simply loses focus, and on the 42nd sheep, he absent-mindedly forgets to speak the words?
Here, we witness the profound mercy built into the system's understanding of psychology. The text explicitly states that if a believer genuinely forgets to utter the name, the meat remains perfectly halal.
The theological reasoning provided for this exception is beautiful. The text quotes the scholar Ibn Abbas, who argued, God's name is in the heart of every Muslim.
The jurisprudential argument is that the internal foundational belief system of the individual acts as a permanent baseline invocation. The spoken word is the required ideal, but the internal state of belief is powerful enough to cover genuine, accidental human error.
However, that internal baseline is fragile. If the individual remembers the requirement, but deliberately chooses to withhold the utterance out of rebellion, arrogance, or pure indifference, that internal baseline is instantly voided. The act ceases to be a ritual and becomes purely secular violence.
And the precision required for the spoken phrase is immaculate. The text issues strict warnings against diluting or mixing the intention. You cannot say, in the name of God and Muhammad.
Because within this theological framework, associating a mortal human being, even a revered prophet, with the ultimate creator is the grave sin of shirk. The Creator holds an absolute monopoly on the giving and taking of life. No human name can share that jurisdiction.
It is an infringement on the ultimate divine copyright.
Furthermore, the jurists warn that you cannot even say, "Oh God, forgive me," as you bring the knife down. Why? Because a plea for forgiveness is a personal prayer. In that moment, your mind is focused on your own sins, your own ego, your own salvation. You are not dedicating the awesome act of ending a life solely to the Creator.
The mental focus of the human being must be 100% dedicated to the solemnity of the transition from life to death.
This absolute requirement of mental focus forces us to ask the final, most complex question regarding intention. We have to return to the very first concept we discussed today, the real estate loophole, and the vital importance of exact timing. When exactly must this intention be locked in?
The text applies the logic of the timeline directly to the utterance. In a standard domestic slaughter, the phrase must be spoken at the exact millisecond the blade touches the throat of the animal.
If a butcher says Bismillah, and then pauses, sets the knife down, takes a drink of water, has a brief conversation with an assistant, and then cuts the throat, the slaughter is invalid. The spoken intention must be physically married to the kinetic action.
But how does this strict timeline apply in the Wild West scenario of emergency hunting? You cannot speak the name when the arrow finally strikes the deer, because by that point, the arrow is miles away and out of your control.
The timeline shifts to accommodate physics. In hunting, the name of God must be uttered at the exact moment the arrow is released from the tension of the bowstring, or the exact moment the hunter slips the collar off the neck of the hunting dog.
Because that specific millisecond represents the final moment of human agency.
Once that arrow is airborne, the human being is no longer in control. The outcome belongs entirely to aerodynamics, gravity, and the will of God. Therefore, the human intention must be irreversibly locked in at the final moment of release.
If a hunter releases the dog in silence and then shouts the name of God while the dog is already sprinting across the field, the jurists rule it is too late. The missile has already been fired without authorization.
It is a staggering philosophical construct. The precise timed utterance of the divine name is the only mechanism capable of transforming a mundane, potentially brutal act into a sacred, legally sanctioned transition of energy from the natural world to human sustenance.
We've journeyed through a massive, logically rigorous ethical framework today. We began by questioning the morality of a neighbor using a paperwork loophole to buy a house, and we ended by dissecting the exact millisecond an arrow leaves a bow in the desert.
What this classical text reveals is a worldview where absolutely no human action is taken lightly. From the precise severing of 4 specific veins to the intense debates over whether an ancient curse manifests in a desert lizard, this legal system forces the human being to remain hyper-aware of their environment, their tools, the biology of the creatures around them, and the hidden state of their own mind.
It is at its core a systemic defense against human apathy. It constantly demands that the individual pause and ask, why am I doing this? By what authority am I taking this action? And what are the unseen consequences of my timing?
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave hovering in the air for you. In our modern reality, our daily lives are largely defined by distance and convenience. Our sustenance arrives in neat, sanitized, shrink-wrapped packages. The modern consumer is entirely divorced from the profound weight of taking a life.
We never have to consider the physics of flowing blood, or the forensics of a floating fish, or the strict quarantine of a contaminated animal.
We have, in many ways, completely outsourced the moral and physical weight of our consumption to invisible industries. But imagine, just for a moment, if you attempted to apply the psychological spirit of this ancient jurisprudence to your life today.
What if you were socially and morally required to declare a conscious, spoken intention out loud every single time you consume something extracted from the earth?
If you had to verbally acknowledge the origin of the object, the labor that brought it to your table, and the life force that was extinguished to sustain yours before taking a single bite, how drastically would that alter your relationship with the physical world? It would force the invisible architecture of our choices out into the light. Keep that in mind the next time you sit down for dinner.